Welcome to the Staffroom, an education podcast which takes a look into the world of pedagogy. In this series, we meet educators far and wide to chat about teaching and learning and share outstanding practice. My name is Tessa Johnson, and I am sitting here with Michael Royale, and we are coming to you from Corpus Christi College in Perth, Australia.
In this episode, we'll be talking about creating the right climate to develop a great teaching and learning culture in schools. With over 30 years' experience, we'll be chatting to former head teacher and leader Tom Sherrington, who is known across the world as a prolific blogger, author and consultant. Tom will be speaking about his recent book, The Learning Rainforest, and offer insightful expert knowledge on what makes great teaching and how to create flourishing learning environments. Stay with us to hear Tom's wise, balanced and practical ideas.
The rainforest being the specimens that you have in front of you, and again, each one of them is capable of finding excellence in their own way. And the rainforest is kind of surprising and interesting, and takes and has twists and turns. But crucially, it's not so unknowable that it's like magic. That there is a kind of science to a rainforest, just like there's a science to learning.
I'm Tessa Johnson.
And I'm Michael Royale.
And this is the Staffroom. So, Michael, you've just spoken with Tom Sherrington. How was that?
Yeah, it was great. Thanks, Tess. He was very insightful and inspirational. Basically, his philosophy balances big picture of great schools with the invaluable detail of what actually makes great teaching.
Nice. And his book, can you tell us a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, so, I'd encourage all teachers to have a read of it no matter what stage they are at in their career. So it's called The Learning Rainforest, and it's just written in a very intelligent but down-to-earth way. And basically, the title is actually a metaphor in which he talks about what makes good teaching and learning. But I don't want to really say too much more than that because he unpacks it in the interview.
Oh, well, regardless, I do love a good metaphor. I do know Tom Sherrington is always on my Twitter feed, particularly lately with his book, whether other people are retweeting it, whether he's posting his blogs. I know he's just started something new, kitchen pedagogy, or he's got some new sort of vlog posts. So, yeah, really, really active in the social media spectrum as well.
Yeah, he really is.
All right, well, shall we have a listen?
I think we should. With nearly 60,000 followers on Twitter, UK-based Tom Sherrington joins us today via Skype to share his educational expertise. Welcome to the show, Tom. Can you give our listeners a bit of a background about yourself and your work?
Okay, well, I'm basically think of myself as a physics teacher that's now moved on to do different things. I was a teacher in England for about 30 years altogether, but I also spent 3 years in that time working in an international school in Jakarta in Indonesia, where we went with my family. And I was a head teacher of 2 different schools as well as the international school. So I've been a teacher, school leader, and about 6 years ago, I started a blog called teacherhead.com, and it picked up, started picking up people reading it. And so I was motivated by that. And I thought, well, I would carry on writing that. So through blogging and Twitter, I've developed the ability to kind of get work as a consultant now. So I now work traveling mainly around the UK, but I've got quite a lot of jobs in international schools where I'll go around and help school leaders and teachers improve the quality of teaching and learning. That's my main specialism.
So you were just saying then with your blog, teacherhead.com, that it has helped you with certain situations like that, and also Twitter. So as well as that, how do you think it has actually developed you as a teacher and a leader?
Well, I think the main thing is that it just brings you into contact with ideas and people. So when I first started, it just seemed, my first experience of Twitter was that it seemed all about celebrities, and I actually couldn't understand it. But then I realised that there are lots of people from the world of education, classroom teachers, policymakers, head teachers, researchers, and that people link to their blogs. It's just opened lots of doors. And then when I realised it was a good way to actually share my own output, and you get feedback from that. So it's been absolutely superb. So there's a kind of online community that I feel very firmly a part of. And I've met lots of the people now face to face, which is also really good at events that are driven by Twitter. So there are some events like the Research Ed movement, which is an excellent movement where people, usually a good proportion of the people at those events know about it through Twitter, but then the other half of the people don't. So it's a nice sort of mix. Yeah, so I think it's changed me as a teacher by understanding a lot about, say, cognitive science. I don't think I'd have picked up on as much as I know about that if it hadn't been for people promoting that on Twitter. And also just hearing about schools that are doing interesting things that some I've visited, some I've just read about. But most of the initial information about what's there has come from tweets or blogs that I've found through social media.
That's great. So basically it's an idea of networking and also, I suppose, collaborating and finding those ideas that you would want to use or think are really great and integrating them into your own practice, essentially.
Yeah, and it's just the dialogue that goes with it. But for me, I mean, there are some people who are kind of all on Twitter and just engage and debate on that. I find debating on Twitter quite unsatisfactory because you end up sort of polarizing. But I do find it as a good way of just saying, here's a blog, here's a link, and you kind of read the depth is really kind of off Twitter. It's sort of in what people have actually written, and then it's just the Twitter is more of just a sharing kind of platform. So people use it for different reasons. There are some people who spend all day on there just arguing back and forward, and I tend to avoid doing that.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good move. I'm definitely the same way on Twitter. So as English teachers, we actually really love the way your book is littered with metaphors. And obviously the biggest one is actually the title, which is The Learning Rainforest.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about this and who your book is actually aimed at?
Well, first, the book was aimed at anyone interested in teaching, so mainly teachers, but also school leaders who are running teachers or anyone around that. But the people I had in mind were teachers. The Learning Rainforest. When I first started my blog, you have to sort of do a strap line under it in the kind of the settings, and I just thought, what should I write? And I put something like into the rainforest of teaching and school leadership, because at that time the rainforest meant the opposite to a plantation. So I was trying to talk about schools being where you needed to have a more organic approach, where it wasn't one size fits all, and I felt that schools would go down a path of everyone being told to do a certain way, things in a certain way, teach in a certain way, and the rainforest concept is saying, no, well, you don't have to do it that way. A rainforest allows excellence to take many forms, and there's not one way of doing that. In the book, it's more about thinking of the rainforest as the students in your class. So the rainforest being the specimens that you have in front of you, and again, each one of them is capable of finding excellence in their own way. And the rainforest is kind of surprising and interesting and takes, and has twists and turns. But crucially, it's not so unknowable that it's like magic, that there is a kind of science to a rainforest, just like there's a science to learning. So learning isn't entirely mysterious. And so it's that kind of art and science combination. I think the rainforest captures the kind of the fact that it's full of awe and wonder and, interesting surprises, but also it's got a kind of logic to it. Plus, there's also the three parts to the rainforest: trees, which is the roots, which is the kind of the conditions that you create; the canopy, which is this sort of represents all the possibilities that there are for learning. But the sort of branch, the trunk and branch structure represents knowledge, that the need to really deliver knowledge in a very deliberate, secure way, so that the canopy can be as exciting and kind of vibrant as you'd like.
Yeah, fantastic. So can you explain to us the characteristics and differences between what you call a plantation environment and a rainforest environment?
Well, yeah, I mean, lots of examples I could give. So, for example, in some schools, someone has an idea, like I don't know, an IT platform, something like Edmodo. Someone comes up with an idea, and a plantation kind of approach that would be, everyone must now use Edmodo. This is a good thing. So we have a kind of whole school rollout, and everyone is forced to use this platform. This is the platform. Everyone must do it, and it becomes, a good thing. Or it could be something like, learning objectives. It's quite useful for the students to see the learning objectives. So they should be written on the board, so it becomes the absolute rule. All classes must start with the learning objectives written on the board. And this is kind of plantation thinking, whereas a rainforest thinking is, Edmodo is quite a fun platform to use. Some people might like to use it. Some people might like to use a different platform. It doesn't really matter, because you can do different things with different platforms. It's up to you to decide what you find useful. And, if you just want to talk to your students about the learning objectives, and it's quite a sensible idea to express them, whether you write them on the board is up to you. And it's just a sort of totally different kind of culture. So, and that extends to all kinds of things, where in a plantation thinking, you just always mandate things, always specify things. And it kind of deprofessionalizes people to quite a high level, because you just feel like you're doing the thing you're meant to do all the time. You stop people from thinking about why. Whereas the plantation kind of philosophy is more, there are reasons why, and you still have to sort of aspire to excellence, but it doesn't have to be through a specific mandated path. And you tolerate divergent thinking. You tolerate kind of people who are slightly maverick sometimes, because they just deliver good outcomes. And you think, well, blimey, I wouldn't have done that way myself, but look, it seems to work, so let's allow that. He's just much more tolerant of differences in the way teachers approach the work. If it's more than tolerant, you celebrate it. You kind of promote people finding a path that makes sense to them.
Yeah, so basically providing a bit more autonomy as well within the education profession, I suppose, for teachers and students alike, which is a really great thing to do. For schools aspiring to establish a rainforest thinking culture and ethos, what are some of the main challenges that leaders should actually know about?
I think the main challenge is to get the balance right between kind of trust and an autonomy, and also providing support and challenge. And that's the hard bit. So, in a typical group of staff, you've got some teachers who just do need support. I mean, it's not like anything goes. So that's an important distinction to make. So the hard bit is to say, well, I've got to create a culture where all those guys over there can go off and do their thing, and I'm going to really celebrate that. But that doesn't. But I also need to provide more structured support for these guys here, either maybe because they're new or they're finding the job hard, and that's the hard bit. It's the fact that you need to have little pockets which are a little bit more controlled in the school, just because teachers do need that support. So, and the other thing is to sort of not have to control everything. If you say to a group of teachers, come up with a really good assessment process that you think would really work, and then look at what they've done. That requires a bit of trust, whereas sometimes leaders feel that they need to direct that and make it all the same across all the departments. And that's another challenge, that school leaders need to allow differences to emerge, which are valid and authentic to a subject. So, the way that you might assess in English is very different from how it is in art or maths. But sometimes school leaders feel that, then parents won't understand that, so they need to make it all the same. But I just don't think that's true. That's one of the main things. And sometimes you have to allow people to do things that you don't necessarily agree with if you're genuinely going down that path. And that you have to debate it at least. But I think that's the main thing. A lot of people who I talk to about this kind of thing are worried that what you're doing is allowing kind of weak practice to sort of be reinforced. But I don't think that has to happen. But you do need to be conscious of that need to support. So the managed rainforest, I talk about that in my book. Sometimes that's a better metaphor, because you don't it's not like you just let the whole thing run wild, and just say, and allow things to just be slightly poor quality over in the corner. You actually have to spot all the things which are not flourishing and address those things.
How would, I suppose, leaders go about finding that fine line between what's considered support and what's considered controlling? Do you think that's something they would struggle with in itself?
Well, I think this all comes down to creating a professional culture where, to the greatest extent, people are, involved in driving their own improvement. You're talking about evidence and how do we know things are working. And if you've got a good, healthy sort of triangulation going on between sort of assessment data, observations, and tracking student work, and it's getting students say about how things are going. If you've got a good sort of set of evidence that you're using to evaluate quality, then usually it's quite clear. You get most school leaders would feel they had a good idea of where those pockets were, and you have to have some sort of systematic aspect to that as well. But where things are going well, where teachers clearly are on top of what they're doing, you do need to just give them the green light to go off and explore and do things in a way that they feel right. I think there's a mistake in people just sometimes glibly saying, I trust my staff, because as if that's the answer to everything. Because there are some teachers who just need help. If in their second or third year of teaching and you say, go and design an assessment regime, and they might not have a clue. So it might not be the best idea for them to do that and just say, I trust them to know what they're doing. Well, they might not. So you have to have a dialogue with them and work with them, working side by side, and talk more about collaboration and mentoring, coaching, that kind of thing, so that people feel that they're part of a dialogue and not just left to sink or swim.
Yeah, definitely. So our school is actually working on a school-wide pedagogy at the moment and wrestling with both progressive approaches and traditional approaches. What are your thoughts on this debate?
I think it's something. Well, I do think it's important. I mean, I used to say that it was a false dichotomy and then there was no difference, but that's not. I've learned that that's not really right, because I come across just differences in philosophy all the time to do with which have a kind of progressive traditional kind of dimension to them. The most recent one on Twitter was about whether you should allow students to go to the toilet during lessons, and there's a whole sort of and people on the opposite sides of that argument definitely fall into the traditional progressive camps, there's no doubt. The trads are more likely to say no, kids can learn to control themselves and should go to the toilet at break time. The progressive people are more likely to say the kids should be able to go to the toilet on demand. It's sort of inhuman not to let them. And I find myself very much in the trad camp on that front. I mean, in a big comprehensive school, the idea that kids could go to the toilet whenever they wanted would be ludicrous. And really, that's how I'd see it. It just would be a disaster. But we all have our different views. So the way I see it is that there are aspects of traditional teaching which have been disparaged over recent years in an unhealthy way, like people talking about chalk and talk as if that's a terrible idea. Didactic teaching. No one ever is called a didactic teacher in a positive way, but actually, instructional technology, instructional thinking is really, really important. You need to be able to explain things, model them. And there's some really good evidence of that in the cognitive science, that good teacher-led instructional teaching is very effective. Also, sort of things like getting students to sit in rows. There is all sorts of schools of thought around this. Like, I remember being at a training once where people were told it's a proven fact the best way for students to sit is in an L shape, so they can look at each other or face the front, as if this was some sort of absolute truth. But so I think some of these debates are a bit spurious, but the progressive kind of ideas around, say, discovery learning are actually worth debating. So there's a lot of evidence through cognitive load theory and various things where and there's some good studies about discovery learning in maths, for example, where it really just doesn't work very well. It's not like it's just an option. Let's get the kids, there's lots of studies showing that kids are left to sort of find things out for themselves in maths, can form horrible misconceptions, which undermines their confidence in the future. And they'd have been better taught in a very direct, step-by-step way. But then it's all about the sequence. So, I mean, I've worked in a school where, because the students' sort of baseline knowledge was good, they were capable of incredible things on their own. So it's all about, well, when is the right approach? So when I worked in a grammar school, the students could pre-read a poem, bring it into the class, and have this sort of group debate, which was very rich in knowledge, incredibly effective in terms of sharing their ideas. And you would say that is a progressive technique delivering really secure learning. But it only worked because they had the skills to genuinely engage with the poetry at a very informed level. So it worked that way. If you'd given some students who really were struggling with poetry that task, it would have been a disaster. So that's the subtlety you need. It's not about whether they're good or bad. It's about whether they work well at the time. One of my favorite studies around this whole issue is the study into collaborative learning or group work by Robert Slavin, where him and his team find that cooperative learning can be incredibly successful. So it has a big effect size in the kind of research terminology. But it only works where the students are given a certain sort of set of parameters, specifically that all the people in the group need to show that they have individually succeeded, and in order for the group to succeed. So the students spend their time teaching each other and making sure they all know the stuff. But what they also go on to say is that most group work that they find isn't like that. Most group work that is done de facto is, off you go, guys, to do this task, make this product. And then when that happens, 2 or 3 kids do all the work, the others stand around watching, and it's not very effective. So here we go. Is group work a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it doesn't make any sense to say that. It depends exactly what type of group work, what the rules were, what the parameters were. When it's good, it's very good, but most of the time it isn't. So it's a subtle thing. So you can't have this sort of trad prog debate about group work unless you're talking about the actual thing that the students were being asked to do. And that often is missing from the debate.
From what you're saying, you have to be adaptable based on stuff like subjects, students, and potentially the actual, approach that you're taking for that particular lesson, whether it be a more traditional one or a more progressive one.
Yeah, and I also think there's a diet. So one of my ideas that I talk about in the book is mode A and mode B teaching. So mode A teaching is instructional. It's I'm the expert, you're not. I'm going to tell you things. You need to do what I've suggested and practice. It's kind of very teacher centered, but very instructional. But there are also things like group work, open-ended projects, aspects of discovery. Lessons where you just down tools and tell stories or whatever. And that's all part of a good curriculum. But you just need to get the balance right. And I'm a physics teacher, so most of the time I need to be in a fairly instructional kind of frame of mind, mode A teaching, which is fairly traditional, because that's the best way to get the information across. But if I only taught that way, it wouldn't be an ideal curriculum. There are moments peppered in amongst that where I need to sort of do it differently. And the students can't understand electricity and circuit theory if they've never fiddled around with wires and bulbs and things. They need to know what you're doing. So they need to get their hands dirty. They need to experience those things. And it's the same with English. I mean, if you're always just being told what to think about a book, for example, it's not going to give students a full appreciation of what literature can offer. So there are lots of there's a balancing between these two modes of teaching.
Yeah, definitely. Which actually leads me into the next question. We really like your ideas on curriculum, and can you maybe explain to us what you think makes a great curriculum?
Well, I think a great curriculum is one where you combine a number of different elements. So one of my favourite books, if you like, which has influenced me, and I talk about this quite a lot in the Learning Rainforest, is the Trivium by Martin Robinson. And in the Trivium, he talks about the ancient Trivium and trying to make it a 21st century version. And the ancient Trivium had 3 arts: the grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. And the grammar is the knowledge, so the students need to know things and know that. And a good curriculum has a really secure knowledge base. And say history teachers are very clear: these are the facts students must know. And in literature, there's the canon. These are the texts which, for a good education, students should have access to, and so on. But then there's also the next thing is the dialectic, which is the exploration. You don't just take knowledge at face value. You learn to explore it, to debate it, to question it, to experience things. So a good curriculum has to have this element of experience and debate, where you do get students to question things. And finally, the rhetoric, which is how you communicate. A good curriculum has opportunities for students to learn to express ideas in different forms, and that could be through written forms, or producing products, or learning to express themselves in making speeches, or debating, or being good public speakers, just being confident in expressing their views. So that's one way of expressing the curriculum, which I think is really, really helpful. And that's essentially what then I go describe in more detail in the book about how you can bring that into reality in a school.
Yeah, great. So a chapter which resonated with us was How Does Assessment Work? Can you tell us why you think we need to shift away from summative data tracking and move towards authentic formative assessment?
Yeah, I mean, the main reason I think we should make that shift is because it's the more effective in terms of moving students forward. And we just spend way too much time collecting data at a level which serves the purpose of trying to communicate to school leaders or parents at a level of data which looks like it's the same, so that people think it has a certain meaning. But any data in that form, say grades or levels or numbers, is actually a long, long way from telling you what students know and can do. So what I'm suggesting we do is spend a lot more time thinking about, for example, if you let's say you did a history test and a history essay, and you got a mark for it, you got given a B, and you say to this child, you have a B for your history. Now, what does that actually mean to them? I mean, actually, what it was, the reason they didn't get an A is because these are some important pieces of information which you don't seem to know, and you need to learn them. And a more authentic assessment in there would be to actually focus on, here's the knowledge that you have not acquired about this area, this topic. Or it could be in science. You give a mark out of 50 on a test, student gets 35. You start morphing that into a grade or some other level to be the same as the history grade. You lose a lot of meaning. Whereas 35 out of 50 on a test on electricity tells you there are some gaps, and it makes you focus on the gaps that are in the sort of substance of the subject. So really, we should be spending a lot more time just trusting teachers' mark books to tell the story of how students are doing, and not trying to make them morph all that real information into some sort of centralized data tracking system which produces sort of spurious flags. Because, in my experience, even if you get a very sophisticated system doing all that tracking, and then you go back to the teachers, and they already know the students they're concerned about, it doesn't help them. It doesn't help them do a better job. The question that people need to be asking is, once you know a student is struggling, what do you actually do about it in curriculum terms? What things can you get them to practice more? What things can you get them to relearn? And that's the question we don't ask enough. So anyway, I mean, I don't know what it's like for you in your school, but in England, some schools are still utterly crushed by the weight of their centralized data system. They do a data drop every 6 weeks, producing these enormous spreadsheets with lots of tracking, and you're told the maths department is 1.3% below target or whatever, and it's just all, none of that helps. I don't think any of that helps, because it's too far away from the actual original information about how the students are progressing.
Can you give us some examples of what good responsive teaching looks like?
Yeah, well, responsive teaching is all about teachers using information that they get from this class to change how they teach. So, for example, it would be to do with questioning. You go into a lesson where a teacher is being responsive, they're asking lots of questions, and then they actually hear what the students are saying, and then re-explain. Go, oh, hang on a minute, okay, well, what about this and what about that? And they go back with subsequent follow-up questions, which which depend on what the students have said. So, and that needs to be around the class with asking lots of different students what they think. So, too often I find teachers are happy with one or two students giving them a correct answer and they move on, but they have a whole class of students. A good responsive teaching process would be teasing out responses from lots of different students and then asking lots of really good follow-up questions to sort of deepen their thinking.
So can you tell us about part 2 of your book, The Learning Rainforest in Practice?
Yeah, well, what I did there, because when I talked about the metaphor earlier, you have the roots of the tree are establishing the conditions, and then the trunks are building knowledge, and the canopy I call exploring possibilities. So part 2 of the book has a chapter on each of those 3 things, and there are 20 strategies that I've described for each one. So in establishing the conditions, you've got things to do with behavior management, which is obviously important, but also to do with high challenge. So I have a whole sort of set of ideas to do with teaching to the top and how that's really important, I think, to create a high challenge environment. And finally, it's about planning the curriculum to have, a really well mapped out sort of knowledge basis. And all those things are things you can do in advance. That the building the knowledge structure is to do with modes of instruction, so questioning techniques, explaining, modeling, and mainly it's to do with what happens in the classroom, and lots to do with retrieval practice and getting students to demonstrate their knowledge and deal with the fact that they're going to forget things unless you get to practice that, and using lots of low stakes quizzing, that kind of thing. And the final one, exploring the possibilities, is where you say, well, your students have got secure knowledge, so what can they do with it? And there are various things there, like group work and open-ended projects, going off piste in different ways. And my favourite area which is near the end, which is the process of co-construction, which is something which I think is a kind of high-end teaching aspiration, where you have students who already secured enough knowledge for you to really work with them side by side, and they end up delivering parts of the course, teaching some of the lessons, and you kind of work as partners with them in plotting your way through a curriculum, and that's an exciting way to teach.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. So we've been aiming to make some of your ideas routine within our own classrooms, such as think, pair, share, multiple choice quizzing, and whole class feedback. So what are your top 3 practical approaches that you'd recommend a new teacher to use?
I think the first ones, I would say cold calling. So the teaching strategy where you make sure everybody is prepared to answer. So instead of hands up and just ending up with people competing to answer and certain people answering, it's I ask a question, people think, and then I select people to answer. That's a really important strategy. A second one I would say is to use what I would call checking for understanding, which is that even when we think we've aired an idea in a class and we've discussed it and explored it, is making sure multiple students can express that. So let's say we've discussed a poem and we've shared ideas, and as a teacher you've inputted lots of things, and between us as a group we've kind of come up with some idea about why the poet did something. You say to somebody, well, what do you think? Just make sure you've understood, and you rehearse back what's been understood to see whether that's kind of worked. That's the second thing. And the third one I would say is the idea of specifying knowledge for future recall. Because even when you've had this discussion about this poem, for example, the next thing is to say, okay, so when we talk about this next time, what are the main things everyone should know? And you kind of list them out and you say, so we've talked about this, and this. So those are the 4 main things. So let's remember next time, if you talk about this poem, these are the 4, and you're kind of really precise about that, because that helps students then remember that later, and you sort of quiz them on that. So, so the cold calling, checking for understanding, and specifying the knowledge that students should know later, I think are probably the 3 I'd go with for a new teacher.
Great. I especially like the idea of cold calling, because I'm actually quite a recent graduate myself, and I do have a lot of students, like you were saying, competing and putting their hands up so suddenly, especially in some of the earlier years. So it'd be great to have that sort of approach and, allow everyone, whether they like it or not, to share a bit of a response. So before you go, Tom, can you tell our listeners where they can find you online and where they can find your book?
Yeah, well, online, I'm on Twitter at teacherhead, which is the name that I use, and my blog is called teacherhead.com. So that's fairly straightforward. And in fact, both of those, the link to my book, The Learning Rainforest, is on both of those places. It's a link to the Amazon. If you just put on Amazon Learning Rainforest, it comes up. So that's the best place to find it. It's quite easy to find from there.
So we know you've actually started a YouTube channel quite recently as well. Can you maybe tell us a bit about that?
Well, I had the idea that because I spend all my work now is in front of teachers explaining these ideas, and so I thought, if I made a short set of videos, it maybe would help the ideas come off the page, and some of the blogs maybe would be better if I explained them rather than people just reading them. So I had a go at them, and the initial response was pretty positive. So I carried on. So I've done a series of 5 so far based on the blog called The 5 Areas of Feedback I Give to Teachers Most Often. So I've basically taken each one of those 5 and talked about it in front of my computer and with my garden in the background. So and I'm sitting in my kitchen, so I called them Kitchen Pedagogy. That's the name of the series. So I'm going to see how that goes. If people watch them and I see that there's enough people taking an interest, I'll carry on. But so far, so good.
It's a great idea, I think. Tom, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. There's a lot that I've been able to take away from it, and particularly with that last part where you mentioned some of the approaches for a young teacher like we're talking about. I would definitely like to be able to implement some of those into my classroom practice. So thank you so much.
It's been really good talking to you. I'd love to come and visit you sometime. That would be good.
Oh, that'd be amazing. Please do. Thank you, Tom. So Tess, that was the interview. What'd you think?
Yeah, fantastic. A lot to take away from there. Very, very interesting guy. I really liked what he said about knowledge and how, we're sort of returning to this traditional style of teaching with, moving away from the push of, trying to do everything creative and interactive all the time. And he's actually saying, no, slow down. Kids actually need a knowledge base before they can go and do that stuff. Like, yeah, fair enough, go and do your creative stuff. But first, return to that sort of teacher talk, modelling, giving the kids the knowledge base to work with before they go and, use all their skills. What did you take away, Michael?
So I found the second half of his book really beneficial for me as a new teacher, and it was basically talking about the different approaches that he would actually use in his classroom. So cold calling, for instance, where he would just choose a student to share their ideas as opposed to saying, all right, put your hands up. And I thought that was a really great idea, and it's something that I would happily use in my classroom from now on.
It's a little bit scary, though, cold calling, because you don't want to make a kid feel uncomfortable, but at the same time makes them accountable. I've tried it before, and I try to do it more and more, but it's sort of anxiety-inducing for the teacher as well, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I just think it's a great idea in the sense that you won't get those same hands popping up all the time, or as he actually said as well, kids competing against each other to try and get that answer out before the other one. Thanks so much for listening to The Staffroom, and thanks to our guest, Tom Sherrington. If you would like to follow us on Twitter, my handle is @Michael_Royale, and Tessa's is @Tessa_Johnson 2.
Please make sure you subscribe to our podcast on either iTunes or Stitcher. And feel free to leave a review and give us any feedback on the show. This has been the 5th episode of The Staffroom. Listen out for episode 6, which will be available shortly.
I'm Michael Royale.
And I'm Tessa Johnson.
Until next time.